So I conceptualized this talk. This is a talk that actually has undergone quite an evolution. It started off as an Ignite. That's the funny thing. It started off as a 5-minute talk where I just kind of spoke about some of the trials and tribulations of the open source ecosystem. And over the course of the last maybe year and a half, the open source ecosystem has undergone a lot of changes. It's been a pretty harrowing year in the open source world. Trials and tribulations and complexities of building a sustainable open source business. And so I'm going to bring some of my experience from that and share with you a little bit of what's involved with doing so. And eventually, why you should even care about this. So this is a quote taken from a report that I referenced throughout the talk. And I think there's no greater truth than this. Free software made it easier for people of all demographics to learn to code, making technology accessible to the world. If technology and coding was historically kind of the inheritance of an exclusive caste, suddenly open source technology came along and it democratized technology. It fundamentally changed the way we can build and consume technology. John O'Bacon tells a really great story. John O'Bacon, the former head of community at Canonical and GitHub. He told it firsthand at the last DevOps Day. Some of you might have heard it. And I think it's one of the best representatives of kind of how it has the power to change the world. So John O'Bacon tells a story of a young African man who sent him an email. And he told him that he would do chores around the village all week long so that he could walk 2.5 hours in the blistering sun to contribute code to the Ubuntu project. And this is because Ubuntu in Zulu is the essential values of compassion and humanity. And he was so attached to the name of this project that he would really spend his whole week in order to just be able to take part in this community. And that's what open source made possible. But in order for us to understand, I've been in this world for quite some time, and over the course of the last year, there have been some changes in the industry that have been threatening the way that open source can continue to thrive. This is something that I started talking about as early as 2017 at OpenStack Summit Boston with this panel called The Amazon Effect on Open Source Business Models. And recently in March, AWS released its open distro for Elasticsearch, and because I was no longer at a commercial open source company, I felt that I really had to say my piece. And this eventually is a post that kind of has been making the rounds and snowballed kind of out of hell and has continuously been referenced across the board in many publications. But the most important thing is that it brought the discussion to the forefront. The discussion of how we can continue to maintain and sustain open source technology, because it is becoming increasingly difficult. My goals from this session is to try and give you a general understanding of really the trials and tribulations and challenges involved with building a sustainable open source business and project, a little bit about what sustainability means, the type of business models involved, and why this should matter to you at all, why this even matters. So while I know that you guys are all in the technology space, many of you were born into an open source world. So I'm going to, as briefly as possible, touch on kind of the history of open source technology, how it came about, and the people that stand behind building from the ground up this extremely valuable ecosystem. So, who is it? Richard Stallman. Ding, 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 we have a winner. Okay, Richard Stallman, president of the Free Software Foundation, also the GNU project. Richard Stallman was an academic at MIT in the late 70s, and he witnessed firsthand kind of some of the trends that were happening in the decades before that with technology, and that's why he kickstarted the Free Software Foundation, the GNU project in the early 80s. In the late 50s and 60s, you would procure hardware, and it would come tightly coupled with software. You would essentially buy this kind of monolithic stack of hardware and software tightly coupled, and there wasn't really much you could do about it. And that's what you paid for. Along came Unix and POSIX-based systems in the late 60s, early 70s, and suddenly software and hardware got decoupled. And you could consume software separately from hardware. And these big corporations suddenly understood they were sitting on a gold mine, and they started attaching very costly licenses to software as well. Now, Richard Stallman, being an academic at MIT, like I said, in academia, software was largely shared and collaborated upon, and he understood that locking down software would be a huge hindrance to innovation and progress. And so he understood that we would really need to create viable, robust alternatives to proprietary software. And that's when he kickstarted these two projects, GNU being recursive for GNU, not Unix. Very dorky. Okay, so the four fundamental freedoms of, I'm supposed to say the freedom to, I don't know if we can read it, but the four fundamental freedoms of open source software, open source, free software, libre software. These are all the same thing, just with a different name. Open source being the rebranding that that Red Hat did in the late 90s for the name free software, because there was a common misconception that free was referencing the price tag and not the liberty of using the software. Free as in, so Free Software Foundation's tagline is free as in speech, not fear. So when we talk, throughout this talk, when I reference free software, open source software, it's software that's aligned with these four fundamental freedoms: to run the program as you wish, study how the program works and change it, redistribute copies to help others, distribute copies of your modified versions. I'm not referring to proprietary closed source software not aligned with these principles that's offered for free, like VMware ESX or graphics drivers. I'm talking solely about software that aligns with these principles. And this definition has its gaps. Today's more modern commercial open source software companies are finding it increasingly difficult to align themselves with this definition, with larger organizations coming along and really swooping right in and taking the fruits of their labor. And it's really getting much. So the idea behind open source software generally was to provide a, so open source software's primary purpose was eventually to be a commoditization play, to provide truly viable alternatives to proprietary and costly software. Along came the early 90s, Linus Torvalds comes around and releases the Linux kernel, which was kind of the missing piece for the GNU project, to be able to provide a truly viable alternative to operating systems. Linux being a kernel, not an operating system, as sometimes misunderstood. And then along came, the Apache web server, browsers, and Android for mobile operating systems. And the database world is actually quite an interesting one. Historically, databases were also closed source. Oracle was probably the primary vendor. And eventually, when MySQL and Postgres gained popularity, Oracle bought MySQL, and then the community was forked to MariaDB. But it's interesting, and so Oracle eventually bought MySQL, but the interesting evolution around databases is that eventually, the large majority of databases today are actually offered as open source technology. And even cloud has its fair share of technologies that have attempted to provide open source alternatives, from the obvious OpenStack and CloudStack, but even Kubernetes was Google's attempt at commoditizing Amazon Cloud by moving more workloads into their own cloud. They rolled out this technology, and they were the first to offer a managed service around it. Now, Google, being a first-class citizen in the open source world, and not technology vendor as its core business, it's kind of a side business, for the most part, offers a large part of its technologies that are just enablers to their business as open source. So this is something that some of the other cloud giants can learn from. So all of these technologies together eventually created the LAMP stack, a cookie cutter, robust alternative to formerly proprietary stacks. And this created an exponential increase in technology workloads. And this was actually one of the key drivers to virtualization in cloud, because suddenly there was an exponential growth in workloads being rolled out. And this really made it possible for organizations to build versus buy. Instead of having to buy costly proprietary shelfware, which is really just a black box, and what you see is what you get. What open source technology provided was innovation. There are many misconceptions about the fact that, and while it is more economical obviously to build with open source technology, that's not the key differentiator behind open source technology. Open source technology enables innovation. It's the intelligence of the masses. It enables you to customize, build, and do really innovative things with the technology. And everything is built one on top of the other, right, like Lego. So most of the web scale companies today are investing in excellent engineers and building excellent stacks. AppsFlyer among them, versus buying, costly shelfware. And the wild success of open source technology eventually instigated the whole foundation model. Foundations were founded in order to manage the overhead involved with managing large-scale projects. Eventually, it became a full-time job to manage these open source projects, and there was a lot of financial and legal matters that needed to be managed on an ongoing basis, and that's why foundations were founded. You can imagine what the Linux Foundation and the Apache Foundation initially hosted. But then once they found this repeatable and systematic way to manage and maintain open source projects, to onboard sponsors and contributors and maintainers, they started to incubate new open source projects. And now they've housed many fledgling open source projects and enable them to grow in a safe environment and eventually graduate to be self-supporting open source projects. Cloud Native Foundation is actually an interesting one. It's a spin-off of the Linux Foundation. So even these foundations eventually spawn off more foundations, and hosted at the Cloud Native Foundation is Kubernetes and Containerd and some of the more popular container projects. The OpenStack Foundation has also tried to replicate this model more recently. Historically, they were a one technology shop also, and they recently graduated two projects out of incubation, Zool and Kata containers. And many of the programming languages that don't have a viable commercial model around them, and I will touch on that later, are also hosted at foundations like the Python Software Foundation. So just so we're aligned on terminology, I'll explain a little bit about upstream, fork, downstream. This is terms that are constantly used in the open source world, and I'm going to reference them later. So the upstream is the raw version of the vanilla version of the technology that's released sometimes by the foundation, sometimes by the commercial open source project. It is then forked by companies that want to build upon this technology, and a downstream release is then released. It's a proprietary version from one of these technology houses, and many times when they make changes, security, bugs, things like that, they many times contribute code back upstream to the next version of the technology that will be released. Upstream and downstream is many times compared to oil and gas. So oil is the crude version, and then gas is the more refined version. Is everybody with me till now? Okay. So this is purposely a very messy slide, but it's just to give you a sort of understanding of the amount of technologies that started to become released following the GNU Project Free Software Foundation. All of this kickstarted exponential workloads, and open source technologies were released, and all of this was a driver for the adoption of cloud. So today, when the cloud giants are possibly the biggest threat to open source technology, it's almost ironic. It's like biting the hand that feeds them. And this is the growth in just in a graph, so it's more easy kind of to see, of the open source licenses applied in GitHub repos. This is a snapshot from GitHub and Black Duck. From over the course of the years, MIT being the most popular license, which actually surprised me. That's probably a shout out to Richard Stallman. But there are different kinds of open source licenses from MIT, Apache GPL, but there are also more restrictive open source licenses like AGPL, and even these sometimes don't protect the commercial open source companies sufficiently. MongoDB changed their AGPL license to SSPL, because they didn't find the AGPL enough restrictive enough in order to sustain their business. Okay, so that's a little bit on the history. I know that was a mouthful, but let's talk a little bit about the landscape as well, what it looks like to be an open source project. And we kind of need to think about this and be a little bit afraid, okay? And I would say even be very afraid. This is a really interesting report that I suggest everyone read, Roads and Bridges, the Unseen Neighbor Behind Our Digital Infrastructure. The large majority of the services that we all consume, our critical infrastructure, is powered by open source code. And the people that are maintaining these projects are crumbling under the load. We don't need to look much farther than the NPM left pad disaster to understand how fragile it all is. Many people from the Python community have been very vocal about their burnout around maintaining open source projects. And it's a pretty thankless job. When we're talking about the community and individual contributor supported projects, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain developer mindshare over an extended period of time. Because this is what it looks like. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but this gives you a little bit of perspective of what it's like. Outside your door stands a line of a few hundred people. They're patiently waiting for you to answer their questions, complaints, pull requests, and feature requests. You want to help all of them, but for now you're putting it off. Maybe you had a hard day at work, or you're tired, or you're just trying to enjoy a weekend with your family and friends. These are the people standing behind these open source projects. Nolan Lawson wrote that post. He many times live streams his open source work. He spends 3.5 hours on a Saturday morning maintaining open source projects. He inspired NoobChat to do the same, an hour and a half, just in order to support open source projects. I'd like to give you a little bit of perspective. Is Idol here? Idol? No, not here. Okay, this is our Aerospike CLJ library. And just this very small library consumed by very few people. He invests a few hours a month in maintaining this library. So just think about the ones that have exponential usage. This is what it looks like. Let's give you some perspective. In the beginning, these are a few pushes by the core writers of the project until it's getting its ramp up. And then suddenly it goes into whoosh, hockey stick of pull requests, pushes, feature requests, issues, comments, complaints, and this is what they're up against. And this is on a monthly basis. And this is the amount of input they have to put up with, and this is just a side project. This is something they're doing on their volunteer time, giving from their own personal time and their family time in order to maintain these projects. And these are the things we say to them. Thanks for nothing. This is Untitled from our very own community. Project as old as 2007. I stopped development in 2012. I replied to the email within 15 minutes on a Friday night, 1:30 a.m. while traveling. And that was the answer. More. I'm totally bummed out by the inexplicable omission of my feature. And she says, we've pushed 580 commits to master this year. If it's that important to you, we certainly welcome a pull request. Otherwise, we appreciate your patience. There's a sort of entitlement around open source projects. This is the way people are made to feel that are maintaining these projects. I've been around long enough in open source to understand the hype cycles and the trolls, but it still causes heartache and demotivation. This is how the people standing behind these projects feel. So let's take 1 second and be thankful to the people who maintain the open source projects that we use on a regular basis. Let's say it together. Thank you. Put your hands together. Woo! Go to the open source maintainer. It's a pretty thankless job. This is what it looks like to be an open source project. Okay, House Innovators is kind of your peers in the industry, also rolling out stellar technology. Sometimes maybe out innovating you. You constantly have to be maintaining your developer mindshare and features and roadmap and kind of be ahead of the game in order to stay relevant. But then there's the incumbents in the industry, the people with big projects that also want to continue staying relevant. Many times they offer software bundles with seemingly similar technology bundled in for free in order to maintain their market share. And then there's the house giants that see all of this excellent community you've built and all of the excellent technology, and they want a piece of the pie as well. And you constantly have to be in this mindset of disrupt yourself before someone else does. So this is while you're maintaining your project and trying to stay ahead of the curve and fend off the incumbents and the giants and whatever it is, and you still have to continue trying to out-innovate your competitors. This is a very, very difficult landscape to navigate through and build a sustainable and long-term business model. And this is what it also looks like from a disruption perspective. You roll out what you imagine is an exciting and new technology. Boom, something comes along and disrupts your your industry. Puppet, Chef, not just Chef, Ansible, SaltStack, many others, Cloudera, Hortonworks, OpenStack, CloudStack, and then all of the container technologies. And this is what it constantly looks like. This is what you're up against. And once you start, and once you finally feel like you've made it, and you really rolled out an excellent product, and you have an excellent and thriving community, along comes AWS or whatever cloud giant, and they roll out your project as a managed service with their captive audience, and really commoditize your business model. And it's just becoming increasingly difficult to justify actually creating open source technology. When I was at my previous job, I would often get asked by VCs, well, what prevents Amazon from coming right along and swooping the fruits of your labor? And there is no good answer to this question. There simply is not. So let's talk about sustainability. There are kind of three business models. There are kind of three ways to maintain open source projects. Many of today's commercial open source projects, those are projects that were born in open source as companies. They have a project and they built a commercial company around in order to maintain and sustain the project. Many of these projects are venture-backed until they're profitable. And we want it to be the shortest line from venture-backed to being profitable or sustainable or self-sustaining. Because being venture-backed is never a good thing. Venture-backed means increasing involvement in many of the operations of your company, your roadmap, even sometimes your leadership. VCs tend to get involved in all of these things in order to make sure that they get ROI from their investment. There's the foundation-hosted projects, which are open source and open governance, and then the distribution model. So like I said, they're very popular projects that are hosted by foundations, from Apache Kafka and Apache Spark that we use in-house to many others. Companies then fork this vanilla version, and they provide a distribution model on top, which is usually production-grade support, added features, security, many things in order to create a more premium model around these open source projects. And then there's the most difficult kind to maintain, the open and individual contributor supported projects that don't really have any viable commercial model around them. So this is a quote from Sharone in response to the AWS open distro for Elasticsearch. This was the blog post he wrote in response. And it really encapsulates what's involved with building such a commercial open source company. In 2009, I sat down and wrote the first few lines of Elasticsearch and open sourced it, along with our very own Sharone. And I quit my job and spent 2 years investing in building the product and fostering the amazing community that has been built around it. In 2012, we formed a company, Elastic, around it. This is what's involved. They quit their job. They believe so deeply in this technology. They want to offer it as open source because of the innovation, because of the collaboration, because of what open source makes possible. And then, cloud giants come along, they fork their project, and they're made to feel as if their core values are being doubted. So this is just an example, poster children of commercial open source, HashiCorp, Redis, recently, not so recently, already a year and a half almost, Elastic IPO'd a very successful IPO, and it really was groundbreaking because it really did demonstrate how a viable business model can be built around open source, which was something that was dubious for a long time. And interestingly enough, very recently, probably this week, Logs.io, which is kind of a distribution of Elasticsearch, also raised another round, which means that Elasticsearch is here to stay, has proven its viability, and even the forks and distributions of Elasticsearch are finding sustainable business models. And the interesting thing about Logs, while there is some bad blood there, it's not a perfect relationship, but Logs.io was also seen as fair use in a sense of Elasticsearch, because they were also a small fledgling company trying to build something around Elasticsearch, providing production-grade support. There are many companies that offer services around open source companies, and this is still considered fair use. There's a problem when larger organizations, more profitable organizations with captive audiences, look to espouse your core business. Poster children of the distribution model, Databricks, which is a production-grade distribution of Spark. Confluent. Confluent is actually a very interesting story. Confluent was founded after the folks from LinkedIn, they created Kafka. They then open sourced it, open governance, contributed it to the Apache Software Foundation. And then the folks that wrote Kafka actually left LinkedIn and created this company called Confluent to provide a production-grade distribution around the product. Heptio was actually the first distribution of Kubernetes, and they were actually the first to be snatched up as well. It's the original writers of Kubernetes also left and created their own company around Kubernetes as a managed service. But then there's the open and individual contributor supported projects like OpenSSL. OpenSSL is actually a very interesting story. There are projects like OpenSSL and curl and many others, and Carmine that Ben Sless worked on, and I'll talk about that later, that are open source. There's this common misconception that all of the open source projects are largely supported by corporations because they have something in it, and those are the large majority of open source projects. Not so. The large majority of open source projects are actually these that don't really have any viable commercial model around them, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to support them. This project, OpenSSL, got a lot of attention when this vulnerability called Heartbleed was discovered, and then they opened this Pandora's box, and they discovered that it was being maintained, this product being used by millions around the world, the largest corporations using OpenSSL, it's being maintained by a small core of committers of maybe like a handful of people, where one person, it was their full-time job. And then when Heartbleed was discovered, what do you imagine happened? Appreciation for OpenSSL as this amazing project that everyone had adopted? Not so. You received a lot of flack, and then this understanding that, you know, projects like these will not support themselves. People cannot quit their day jobs to support projects that are so highly adopted. And the understanding kind of was set in that there needs to be a sort of corporate responsibility format for some projects that can't be maintained through a commercial business model. And the interesting thing that can be said about this is that Red Hat is very strong in their open source DNA. So there are projects, obviously, that they monetize on, like RHEL and others. But they many times support open source projects that aren't in their core business, out of their DNA and out of their, their value system. And a lot has come up recently about, being able to support and sustain open source projects. And the Linux Foundation recently announced this community bridge, which brings together people that want to sponsor projects and maintainers, and kind of brings people and projects together, which is a really great initiative for finding ways to better support open source projects. VCs, completely targeting open source technology, have been established. OSS Capital is actually founded by one of the folks who was bought by Apprenda, Joseph Jacks. He had a Kubernetes project that was bought by Apprenda, and first thing that he did was start a venture capital firm that focused largely on open source technology. Okay, so this is what it looks like. That was the landscape. That's how to maintain and sustain open source projects. But there's a lot involved with licensing. Like we said, there are the foundations that manage the legal aspects around open source projects. But the commercial open source projects that are built as open source largely have pretty permissive open source licenses. They start as open core, where they have a core that's open, and then they add premium features or things involved that they monetize on. And this is what instigated the license wars. So remember this guy. Richard Stallman, like I said, the original values, the core fundamentals of free software, of open source software, and was recently reaffirmed by the Free Software Foundation, the open source initiative. After the past year, many of the open source companies have started changing their licenses to be more restrictive. He highly believes in what's called a copyleft license, which is basically the most permissive license of open source. But the trust system around this has been broken. And instead of finding better ways to work together as a community, what ended up happening is that more restrictive licenses were rolled out. So like I said, MongoDB SSPL, Redis Labs added the Commons clause alongside Neo4j in this move, which was less popularized. Chef recently changed its business model. I'll touch on why I think it's actually a very smart move on their part. Confluent as well. And this was like an ongoing trend. This is since early 2018 till about now. Many companies have been changing their open source licenses in order to protect themselves against some of the abuse that they've been experiencing. And there's been carnage. There are many projects that have not been managed to be sustained properly and have been shutting down. There are organizations that have had to downsize and make changes and cut staff in order to maintain relevance and sustainability. Let's take 1 second to actually think about a world without NPM. Let's think about it. Maybe it could be forked, maybe it could be recreated, some of the packages, but we saw what happened with the left pad disaster. So think about NPM saying no more and shutting down. Wouldn't this be terrible for everybody? So let's talk about AWS. AWS is not known to be a first-class citizen in the open source world. And so this move of keeping open source more open was extremely hurtful to the open source community, is I guess the best way to put it. And so as a result, recently, the same companies that I mentioned that changed their licenses decided to align themselves with Google Cloud, because Google is known to be a first-class citizen in the open source world. Like I said, most of the technology that is not critical to their business, they roll out as open source, contributing them to foundations that many times their competitors fork and use and leverage and monetize on, like Kubernetes and Android. Who here has a Kindle Fire? Anyone? No? No one? $80? Okay. Well, if you had a Kindle Fire, you would know it does not come with Google Apps installed. Amazon, aren't they nice? And this was recently reaffirmed at the last Google Cloud Summit here in Tel Aviv, emphasizing why it's important for them to integrate natively with these technologies and actually work with them in order to build a thriving ecosystem around them. Because Google understands open source and understands how their open source partners work, and they actually understand the values that open source technology brings. Another company that has been changing their ways is Microsoft. Microsoft, at the very beginning, was very threatened by Linux and by the Apache web server, and took a very anti-open source stance. It took them 20 or 30 years to shake that off. And over the course of the last year, they made a lot of moves in order to really double down and demonstrate their genuine desire to support the open source ecosystem. They purchased GitHub in a move actually to support the company. The company was not doing well from a business perspective, and they wanted to make sure that these open source projects could continue being maintained and sustained. So they purchased GitHub, and GitHub being a Microsoft company, recently the Apache Software Foundation completely migrated to GitHub. Over the course of the last year, Microsoft open sourced 60,000 of their patents, and they continue doing more things around the open source world to demonstrate how all in they are on it. And this is the graph. This is what the graph looks like. Google and Microsoft are often head-to-head in terms of the number of contributors they have in-house for open source. This is Google and Microsoft, as you can see. Let's find Amazon. Isn't that cute? Okay, that's Amazon. Facebook is even above them. Facebook not being a technology company in the classic sense, not a technology vendor. They have React, they have MyRocksDB, they have many other projects that they've contributed open source. Red Hat, being a much smaller company, contributes much more code. So this is what the landscape looks like. This is what the amount of contributions look like. And remember, the incumbents, even the incumbents are doubling down on open source because they understand that open source is the key driver for innovation. They historically built, and while it's excellent closed source technology, I'm not saying that closed source technology is not good technology, they understood that in order to have new engines of growth and to drive innovation, they would need to invest more heavily in open source, and IBM acquired Red Hat for $34 billion, probably one of the largest, it is the largest open source acquisition ever. F5 acquired Nginx recently. VMware acquires Heptio, the distribution of Kubernetes. And these formerly, incumbent closed source companies are understanding that open source will actually be their next, if they were so fearful of open source, they understand it'll be key to their next phase of growth. Okay, so let's take all of that in. That's really just kind of giving you an understanding of what's involved, the challenges, what the landscape looks like. But why does this all matter? Why eventually does any of this matter? Why should we even care about this? So, open source is pushing the frontiers of almost every industry. If it's science and medicine and accessibility and many things are based on open source technology. This is CERN. This is actually quite old. This is a talk that Tim Bell did at OpenStack, Tel Aviv, probably 2016. These were the numbers then. I'm sure it's much larger numbers today. CERN, obviously the Center for Nuclear Research in Switzerland. CERN is actually funded by its member countries, so it has to be as frugal and economical as possible. They also try to build a very frugal architecture that can then be replicated by academia. And so this is their numbers: 8,000 servers, more than 280,000 cores, 33,000 VMs, all on OpenStack. This is important because think about our cloud usage. Think about how exponentially larger theirs is, and imagine how much it would cost them to do this on public cloud that was much more costly. So it really makes the impossible possible. A lot of the progress that's being made on speech recognition, on AI that has to do with medicine and things like that is all based on open source. So really, it's intelligence of the masses, and it's helping to change the world for the better. When we have large companies adopting open source technology and then also contributing back, it makes it more sustainable. And maintaining, like I said, developer mindshare over an extended period of time is an increasingly difficult thing. So we really do want open source technology to be self-sustaining. And if we can create a marketplace of profitability around these projects, that is only a good thing. There are the companies that are unable to build. They aren't born in the cloud like we were. They're not cloud native companies. If it's old school enterprises like insurance and healthcare and energy and things like that are not able to actually build these projects, being able to take a production grade version of an open source project enables them the innovation that they're looking for while being able to run these projects. So this marketplace of profitability enables these companies to put developer resources on maintaining these projects, and then they will eventually be sustainable in the long term. So this is all good. This is win-win for all of us. And it's funny, your no free lunches, Ethan, in your talk, because I say this a lot, there are no free lunches. It's not to be taken for a given that open source technology will always be available. If everybody's only consuming technology, eventually there will be no pie left. We have to think about what we can do in order to give back. This is a very interesting thing. This is the change in Chef's licensing. Recently they changed their licensing. And this is the most interesting part. Take our open source code, create software development, build, fork it, and manage it yourself. What they're basically saying is, sure, go right ahead. Let's see you manage and maintain this project. We know what goes in to building the roadmap, to maintaining the technology, security patches, whatever it is that's required. And this is only one tool in your stack. Imagine you had to do this with all of the tooling in your stack. And so then, when we say we're only 1% done, we like to use this, this phrase, we're only 1% done. We're a large Clojure shop. Clojure is not a very large programming community. I'm going to think about what's involved with maintaining excellent code over an extended period of time. It's not a simple thing. And if every person takes like 1% out of their time and it contributes just a little bit back to the community, it would be increasingly more sustainable and maintainable in the long term. I'm going to reference Ben's talk from the R&D team from a few weeks ago. And he talked about work that he did around Carmine and how he was qualifying other libraries. And how when he was looking at the libraries, he saw that some of them weren't maintained, some of them weren't up to date. And he said he moved on. And then when he realized there wasn't a viable alternative, he went back and refactored Carmine. But that's not a mindset that we can be in. We need to think about what it is that we can do to refactor these projects. They won't refactor themselves. We built the Aerospike CLJ library, but hey, there is one that hasn't been maintained since 2016. And while we needed a more opinionated version to our architecture, and we needed something a little bit different, but sometimes we need to think about what we can do in order to maintain existing projects, make them more viable in the long term, because they won't maintain themselves. And there's a lot that you can do around open source without necessarily contributing code. This is something I like to say to my developer relation friends. This is not relevant maybe for an engineering organization, but you can contribute to documentation. You can answer questions on forums and Stack Overflow. You can just be an evangelist. You can be a human being about these projects, appreciate them. Say thanks every once in a while when you use a project. If a new feature was rolled out, if a new version was rolled out, thank the maintainers, thank the creators. They'll really appreciate it. Start their projects on GitHub, makes them maintain motivation, know that it's still being used, still needed, and it helps them continue wanting to maintain these projects. This is just one thing. So Daniel Stenberg is the writer of curl, and he was recently awarded a very prestigious prize in Sweden. So great success. Eventually, some of these things do get the appreciation they deserve, but it's a long burn. How long? Curl's been around since what, 1997? 97. So 20 years later. Great job, Daniel. Let's put our hands together for Daniel Stenberg and all the rest of the open source maintainers and think about what it is that we can do to help maintain, sustain, contribute to open source projects. It doesn't have to be a lot. It doesn't have to be a lot of your time. Every little bit helps. Because how do you want this to play out? We all know the ending now, but so before this was more relevant, right? Now we know that this is neither one of these is or no spoilers. Never mind. Didn't say anything. But in any case, we want to go back to the old world of closed source, lockdown technology, or do we want to find a new, open, innovative world and really enable us to progress innovation and technology? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. Suggested reading. These are some of the resources that I used in order to build this talk. Things that you should read, you should know about, be aware of, know what this world looks like, and the people standing behind these projects. Thank you.